Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English, and our objective for the hour is to make some observations about one of the most famous novels of the 20th century, a novel called Lord of Flies. Now, we're going to have to, at some point in our conversation, address this title. Let's point out for your notes right away that there's kind of, generally speaking, two types of titles. One kind of title, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, is self-evident. In other words, you can tell from the title what the novel is basically going to be about, right? It's going to be a story about a cat named Tom Sawyer. But there's a second kind of title. And these are more what we would call enigmatic or strange titles. Lord of Flies. There is absolutely no way from that title that you have any idea what the novel particularly is about. You have to read the novel. And then once you finish reading the novel, you will ask, why would he call it Lord of Flies? The novel's title itself requires that you begin to do some thinking about the meaning of the novel. You can literally know all of the events of this novel. I could say it this way, you could have every word of this novel memorized and still struggle to understand why he would call it Lord of Flies. Now, question, do you think that that's deliberate or is that accidental? That's clearly deliberate, right? I mean, Golding is playing a game with us. By the way, he's not alone here. We have lots and lots of examples of this, and if we wanted to, we could go back through some of the readings for ourselves, and we could begin to identify the ways in which writers sometimes play this game. So, as we look at the events of the novel, we're going to find ourselves asking this simple question, what's up with this title? That's going to be one of the questions for us. All right? Now, let's get the plot line out of the way here. I'm working off of the assumption that if you have not at least read the novel, you've at least read some kind of plot summary and or you've watched a film of the novel, so you've got some idea of what goes on. But nonetheless, let's just catch you up to speed. It won't take us long. The plot line of Lord of Flies is actually pretty simple. I mean, in terms of the events as they transpire, it's a pretty linear kind of plot line. You have a group of young boys who end up abandoned, stuck on an island. No adults. This will factor heavily in our conversation. No adults. They are there alone in the middle of the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. They are not just any boys, though. These are young men ranging from pretty young ages up through the upper teen ages.
No, it stops at 12.
Their background is what kind of schooling? This is significant as well.
They're English.
They are English, but what kind of schooling? Private, what kind of private schooling? They are military academy cadets. You got it. Now this will be huge for us. Okay? As we think about the events as they unfold then, you have survival mode. Let's put it like that in our notes. This is survival mode, right? For all of these TV shows where you've got people who are living on an island trying to survive, in some ways they're playing Golding's game of Lord of Flies. Right away, let's identify the ways in which the boys will do pretty well in terms of survivor mode. Mr. Keeley, right away, what is it that they decide to do? Well, they get together and they do what we call diversification of labor. Division of labor, meaning what? Well, there's, generally speaking, two big things they got to do. One, they got to survive on the island, which means what? You got to have food, right? You got to have food. So you got to have a group of people that go out and get food. This can be, of course, in the attempts to try and get, berries off of trees and the like. But ultimately, what kind of food are they looking for? And they become called the what? This group are the hunters. Yeah, their job is to go out and kill something so they can have something to eat. That's kind of necessary if they're going to live long on this island. By the way, early on, that's one of the debates. surely quickly we're going to be found. The longer they realize they're stuck on this island, the more clear it becomes that there's two things they have to do. One, of course, is to survive. That is to get food. The second group, though, is more interested in what?
Control.
In what regards control? These are the guys who decide the only way we're getting off this island is to be discovered. The only way we're going to be discovered is what?
Right.
They're going to see smoke. Let's build a fire. So the group immediately divides into two, division of labor. You've got some kids who are going to work as the hunters. You've got some kids who are going to work to keep this fire going so that they can be rescued. Enter our primary characters. And it's at this point that we began to recognize right away, Golding is almost writing a modern allegorical myth. An allegory. One thing represents another thing. So very quickly, for example, we will identify the ways in which Golding is playing a game of character types, personality types. Now early on, the group, because it's been trained to do so as young boys, the group will use proper etiquette, proper rules of comportment, the way you behave, when they have their group meetings. And there's an important symbol early on in the novel. There's a large shell that's found, a conch we call it, yes? And the rules are pretty simple. They decide that any time that there's going to be conversation, a speaker is going to stand in front of the group. The speaker is only allowed to speak if he has the shell. It's a nice little rule. They invent a rule. In other words, we must have order. Right? We must have order. Of course, their military training would have taught them this, yes, right? Got to have order. We can't all act like a bunch of idiots. We got to make sure we've got some sense of order, decorum. And then we have the primary leaders of the group. Who is the primary leader of the hunter group? What's his name? Jack is his name. Now, Jack is an interesting kind of character. We will call him the Machiavellian character from Machiavelli's classic text, The Prince. Jack is an interesting leader. Jack wants to run the show. He's kind of figured out human psyche pretty well. The best way to run the show and to keep everybody in line is to scare the ever-living poop out of them. Now, the way he does that is to invent a story about a terrible beast that's on the island, and therefore all the younger children can easily be controlled. We have another leader that steps forward. What's his name? To counter Jack's leadership, Ralph. Now Ralph is an interesting guy as well. Ralph is kind of our Platonic leader. From Plato's Republic, we are informed that the best of leaders are the ones who have wisdom, insight. They're the thinkers, and Ralph is definitely our thinker. Ralph, interestingly, is the one who says early on, we must keep the fire burning because that's the only way we're going to get off this island. Interestingly, Jack over time begins to think that, this living on this island, going hunting every day is actually kind of fun and games. Some have argued Jack goes what we call native. That is to say, Jack's not at all interested in being rescued. Why be rescued? Dude, this is as close to paradise as you could ever imagine it to be. Here we are, living in the wild, being able to do whatever we want. Why would we want to be rescued? Interestingly, Ralph is aided by young Piggy, who is an enigmatic character on every count. Piggy is physically a bit corpulent. He has all kinds of physical limitations. Most notably, of course, what?
His weight.
Not just his weight. Most notably, what? He can't see. His eyesight is extremely poor, limited. Without his glasses, the poor child can hardly see the front end of his nose. Okay? This will become significant because at a given point, something really tragic is going to happen to Piggy. At a pivotal moment in the novel, Jack decides it's time to teach everyone on the island a lesson. It's a pretty easy lesson. All you have to do to get rid of your adversaries. Piggy and Ralph have begun to question Jack's leadership focus. Jack takes care of it by doing what? In a pivotal moment in the novel, what does Jack do to poor old Piggy? A large boulder is dropped right on his head. What happens to Piggy? This story becomes then really, really violent. Yes, he actually dies. Jack actually murders the young kid Piggy. And in the process of dropping a fairly nice-sized boulder on top of Piggy's head, all of the other children decide what in regards to Jack and his rule? Yeah, that's right. If you know your Plato, this is Thrasymachus. Might makes right. The guy with the biggest 12 gauge gets to make the rules. It's pretty simple. All of the other children, save Ralph, pretty much go, okay, dude, whatever. But we have to pause because there's another character that's going to be extremely important in this novel. His name is Simon. Now, Simon is a fascinating character because Simon is our poet. Simon is our loner. Simon really doesn't pick sides. He's more interested in exploration. And sure enough, he goes exploring, where he discovers in the course of the novel two really important things. One, he discovers first of all that, yeah, Jack's large beast is in fact no beast at all. Okay? The wind is moving the parachute material, scaring the children into believing that there's something terrible or tragic there. So the first thing we want to say about Simon is, he actually has figured it out. There isn't anything to be afraid of at all. But then we have a pivotal moment in the novel. Earlier, the hunters have killed, in really graphic ways, very violent ways, have killed a pig, a wild boar. They've taken the head of this pig and they stuck it on a post and shoved that head on top of a stick, a post, and in a clearing, Simon stumbles into that clearing, where he looks at the head of this pig. It's beginning to rot, deteriorate. Large numbers of flies are flying, buzzing around the head of this disgusting pig. And Simon has a very interesting conversation with the pig's head. Now, what's interesting about this novel is that to this point, everything that Golding has done is believable. You can believe that children would drop on an island. You could believe that they would break into two different groups. You could believe that one of them would become violent against the other ones to try to take over, etc., etc. All of it's believable. But when Simon steps into the grove or the clearing with the pig's head, he begins to hear the pig's head speaking. Now, what Golding will ask you, the reader, to do is to decide whether these are real words that we're supposed to believe Simon's hearing, or rather these are the thoughts of Simon's own mind. Probably more believable, the latter. As Simon listens to the pighead speak, what is it that the pighead says? Does anyone know? Has anyone read the novel enough to know? What is it that the boar's head, the pig's head, says to Simon about their situation? Well, go ahead.
Doesn't he say that a great tragedy will happen?
In a line, he says, "You're jacked." Oh, wait a minute. Jack is the name of the bad guy. Is that where we get our phrase, "you're jacked up"? This novel becomes one of the most important novels of the 20th century. We cannot overstate its influence in popular culture, okay? To say you're jacked up. Notice we don't say you're build up, right? We don't say you're Jacobed up. We don't say you're Tylered up. We say you're jacked up, right? There may be a reason for this given this novel. Simon is told by the boar's head, yeah, there is an inherent evil, and you cannot overcome it. in the end, you're all destined for doom. Simon, interestingly though, will leave the clearing. He will return to his group to tell them the good news. This is often what we refer to as the Messianic moment in the novel. A Messiah is an interesting figure, a figure who returns to bring salvation, to bring good news. Simon comes running down the beach towards the boys to tell them the good news. There is no beastie, that in fact we have nothing to fear. All of the other boys have built a fire. They have decorated themselves with the blood of the beast they have slain. Now they look completely like primitive savages dancing around the fire. Interestingly, one of them sees Simon coming down the beach, hollering, "I've got good news, I've got good news." That one person is Jack, who will then direct the rest of the boys to attack the beast that is coming at them. And we have our second murder of the novel. Simon is stabbed to death repeatedly by the spears, the self-made spears, that the boys will hunt with. In the morning, an interesting moment. They can't quite recall exactly how Simon got killed, but they are all aware he is now dead. We could, of course, ask the simple question, does Jack have a reason for wanting to make sure Simon's quote-unquote good news doesn't get shared with the rest of the boys? Well, yeah, it's much easier to control individuals when they are in fear, right? Much easier to keep silence for Simon. Simon is executed. The novel then ends with a most remarkable irony. We have irony upon irony. Jack says it's pretty simple to take care of Ralph. He is hiding in the jungle woods. Let's burn him out. We will set the vegetation on the island on fire. There will be nowhere for Ralph to run. We will find him, we will kill him, and then we will be able to live in peace and harmony on the island. Of course, what's darkly ironic, and environmental readers of this novel will love to point out the obvious irony. After you've burned everything on the island to get the bad guy, quote-unquote bad guy for Jack as Ralph, after you've burned everything up on the island, the obvious question is, what's left to eat? Yes, what's left to eat? In other words, in the process of accomplishing their goal, they will destroy the very environment that is necessary for their survival. You can see how one or two environmentalists will take this notion and say, right. So you can make much money by pumping filth into your air, but what happens when you no longer have breathable air or clean water to drink? You can be billionaires without water to drink, which means you're a dead billionaire. Makes absolutely no sense. This will be the first irony, but we're not done. It works. It works. They are able to burn Ralph out of the jungle. Of course, Ralph is running for his life when he runs right into... Yeah, not Jack. Not Jack. He runs right into an adult. An adult? I thought there weren't any adults on this island. Not till one arrives. Really? Well, ironically, it was Ralph from the beginning who said, if we have a large fire with smoke, somebody's going to see it and they're going to... No, somebody's here on the island, they're going to visit the island. Sure enough, that's what happens when you torch the entire island. You have a large plume of smoke. Now, Golding gets very nasty with us at the end of the novel. It's a deeply disturbing ending. It's an ironic ending that we must say out loud, because the adult that finds the island is not just any adult. For example, it's not some fisherman out trying to find, a fish or two in the water. No! Who is the adult that will come onto the island to find first Ralph and then the rest of the boys? It's a naval officer. Why are they in the ocean area anyway? They are engaging in what are called war games. Now, what are those? Military practices, right? Because we're in wartime. Now, what is disturbing about the ending of this novel? Well, there is a certain kind of assumption that readers will have when they read this novel. They will say, well, of course these silly children get together on this island, and because they are silly children, they end up doing terrible things like dropping rocks on each other's heads and things like that. If only they were older. If only they were not children but adults. Conflict resolution would happen differently. You wouldn't have rocks being dropped on people's heads. They'd be able to figure it out by talking to each other and legislating, etc., as adults and big people do. The problem in the novel is that they're a bunch of stupid kids. Make them adults, and there would be a different outcome. But wait a minute. Who is it that discovers the boys on the island? An adult, a military officer, whose job it is to drop large rocks on people's heads. Only instead of rocks, these are explosives that do a little bit more damage to a head than a rock does. Oh, well, that's just nasty of Golding. So in other words, the one hope that maybe we have reading this novel about, well, things would be a whole lot different if it was a... And then immediately, an astute reader of this novel will recognize Golding is playing an interesting allegorical kind of game with us. The island becomes symptomatic of a world where to resolve conflict, people must drop large munitions on each other. Let's say it out loud now. Golding wrote this novel because he was deeply, deeply concerned about the evolving atomic nuclear program and his great concern that the human species would ultimately exterminate itself through the use of atomic weapons. He had some reason to fear, given the way that the Second World War had ended with the dropping of atomic weaponry at both Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Golding was not alone. There were a large number of people who shared these kinds of concerns in regards to conflict resolution. Now, what are we to do with a novel like this, Lord of Flies? Well, obviously, we cannot understand the title of the novel, I began my lecture there, without some kind of reference to the Simon Borshead scene. Before you take the exam tomorrow, go back and find that scene in the novel and read it closely. A number of the questions from the exam will be centered there. And you'll get a sense of kind of what's going on in regards to what's being said when Golding titles his novel Lord of Flies. For those of us looking for a lot of hope and optimism, this may not be the novel to go to. It is a somewhat dark novel, as expressed right there in its title. One of the fundamental questions of the novel is this one. Let's write it in our notes. And before tomorrow, I'd like you to think a little bit about it. What went wrong on the island? We have multiple answers to this question. What went wrong on the island? One obvious answer is there are no adults there to keep the young children in check. It's kind of like imagining a high school without any teachers or administration. What kind of high school would you have if you didn't have any adults? Well, this novel seems to suggest an interesting kind of scenario where early on, young people would have to decide, are we going to do this thing called school at all? Is education at all of value? Are we just simply not going to have education at all? And if we are going to have education of some kind that's formal, we're going to have to invent rules, like a conch shell. One of the pivotal moments early in the novel is when Jack decides he's had enough of the conch shell, and what does he do? He does break it. And in that moment, it becomes a symbol for what we inevitably know is coming. Jack has decided, I don't need law and order, All I need is a rock to drop on somebody's head, and the fear that, of course, will come from that kind of exercise, right? What went wrong on the island? Well, another option. Look, this is a story about a bunch of males. I mean, really? Anytime you put a bunch of males together in one place, you're going to inevitably have rocks getting dropped on people's heads. Put a bunch of females together, and you'd have an entirely different kind of story. See, this again gets somewhat disturbing. What about if we were to imagine that it's not all a bunch of guys, but rather a bunch of girls under the age of 18? Well, see, here again, a number of students at Worland High School over the years have said, yeah, I don't know if it'd be any better, but it might have been worse. This leads us to the next option. Well, here's the problem. Anytime on an island you put a bunch of all of one gender, you're inevitably going to have problems. What you really need on the island is both males as well as females together. Inject a few women onto the island with all of these guys, and then you would have no problems with conflict resolution. Let's keep going. Again, the question that we are asking here to be answered is, what went wrong? Is there a way to fix this situation on the island? What went wrong? Let's look at another idea. Well, here's the problem. They didn't have a really good form of government. They need better rules and law. When law breaks down, then everything kind of goes, quote unquote, to hell. The Lord of the Flies is inevitably coming if you don't have law and order. Once chaos or anarchy starts, well, it's inevitable you're going to have rocks being dropped on people's heads, etc. But the obvious question here is, well, wait a minute, but they started with law and order until someone decided we don't need law and order. How can you make people keep law and order if people don't want to keep law and order? This makes for a problematic question as well. Some have said, well, the problem is that there's not enough religion on the island. Or some have said, the problem is there's not enough science on the island. Of course, both options are understood in the stories of both Simon as well as Jack's manipulation of these crazy rituals that he has them go through. There are some who have said, and this is a dark observation, there isn't anything that went wrong on the island. It's what is. The human condition is this. It is a hopeless condition. The way human beings resolve conflict inevitably is about dropping rocks on people's heads, and there's no way around that. Well, that's a pretty dark assessment of the situation on the island. And it seems to beg the question, well then, are you suggesting that we cannot live together in peace on this island we call the Earth? That we are inevitably going to destroy ourselves and the resources that keep us alive? You can see how Golding's novel becomes a very interesting kind of propedeutic, instructional tool. It's didactic to some degree. And it challenges, of course, readers to ask a very simple question about A, oneself. What character are you most like in the novel? What character do you most identify with? And then B, communal. What kinds of associations and friends do you have? If you and 10 of your pals were dropped on an island to survive, do you think that inevitably it would have to deteriorate into chaos? Or do you think, even if it was 25 or 30 years, do you think that your group could somehow survive the experience of quest for survival? Do you think that's possible? Or inevitably, are you saying it's going to break down? Or would it be better if you just put 20 strangers together, as opposed to you got to choose the people that you would want on the island with you? See, all of these kind of communal questions lead, of course, to this novel identifying what we will call the sociology of the novel. So the novel begins to speak on two levels, doesn't it? It speaks to us at the psychological level, the individual mind, and at the sociological level, the group. And how does the group get along? Can you have a high school where everyone is friends and gets along? Or, inevitably, are you going to have chaos, where people are dropping literal or metaphoric rocks on other people's heads? Welcome to Golding's Lord of Flies. I wish you luck in your examination of tomorrow.